This is House Planning Help episode 33. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is my podcast about self-building and renovating. I'm interested in what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My own personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up today, I want to find out whether conservation techniques are getting better, and my guest is Douglas Kent from the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And off we go on another podcast. Thank you very much for downloading. I do feel like I'm meeting all sorts of amazing people, everyone very passionate in the area that they're involved in. And of course the views differ, it's up to us in our particular case. Hopefully you're finding this content useful for what you want to do. But I thought I'd share, before we go into the main feature, a quick update on my movements, because I attended Grand Designs Live, which is the exhibition of a popular TV show that's on the air in the UK. I think it's screened, well, I know it's screened in Australia and in New Zealand. I'm not so sure about America, although it's probably on a cable channel somewhere. But it was a chance to go along there, and a couple of the highlights for me. Dr. Mike Page from the University of Hertfordshire had put together this building called the Cube, and he was working to his own brief. He wanted to build a compact home no bigger than 3 metres by 3 metres by 3 metres, so 27 cubic metres. The idea being that one person could live a comfortable, modern existence with a minimum impact on the environment. And I loved it. It was timber clad, it was a cube. Not everyone, I suppose, would love the aesthetics, but it just gets you thinking about what can you do with a minimum amount of space. And I think that's impressive. And certainly when we come to Grand Designs, and I know a lot of the houses that they feature on the TV show are huge, you can also go the other way. And we also had our episode with Sarah Suzanka, and I thought that was very good at illustrating this point, how far you can go by just thinking about how much space do I really need. The other point I wanted to mention was I went to a session on retrofitting, and Paul King, the Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council, was one of the panellists. I also got a chance to have a quick chat with him afterwards. But very interesting to hear that he used to live in a contemporary energy efficient home, but now he's retrofitting a period property. And so he's facing a lot of these challenges and dilemmas of what exactly to do. Kevin MacLeod, the presenter of Grand Designs, was there, which I didn't know actually in advance. I didn't realise that he attended these exhibitions as well, but I suppose it makes perfect sense. And he did a short presentation, but recommended 2 pieces of literature. One of them, the Old House Eco Handbook. We interviewed Roger Hunt about this in episode 10, if you want to go back and listen to that. And also something that the Bath Preservation Trust and the Centre for Sustainable Energy put together, which is called Warmer Bath. And I'll link to that in the show notes because it's a PDF that you can download. All of this information didn't mention deep retrofitting at all, which I saw an article in the Telegraph a few days ago. Again, I'll link this into the show notes. This was a piece written by Sarah Lonsdale, and I'll just read the first paragraph. The minimum income a household living in a period home will need in 2030 to avoid suffering fuel poverty will be nearly £100,000. That's equates to around $160,000, according to a report on the energy use of historic houses. This terrifying prediction, based on projected fuel prices, suggests that in less than 20 years, the ownership of period homes will be the luxury of the super rich. It goes on to talk about a passive house retrofit of a Victorian property carried out by Octavia Housing Association. So an interesting article, but I do sense this tension between the different ways that you could be doing it and what is more sustainable. And I must admit, I'm completely confused. So today I wanted to dedicate this episode to just finding out more about the conservation route. If you're going to go down the conservation route and you decided that's what you thought was best, solid wall, period housing, you're buying it for those features. So Douglas Kent is the Technical and Research Director of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And I started by asking him about his background and how he became interested in this area.
Well, I've always been interested in old buildings, and I was brought up in the Saffron Walden area in Essex, and I think just living around a town with such a rich and deep architectural heritage just rubbed off on me and influenced my professional career. And I've been involved with the SPAB now since about the year 2000, and have never looked back. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I really enjoy working in the building conservation field.
SPAB, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. Can you give us a bit of a foundation of how it got going, what it aims to do, etc.?
The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SPAB for short, was founded in 1877 by the designer William Morris, and the objective is to save old buildings from damage, demolition or decay. And at the time, they were very much trying to prevent buildings being restored, in other words, rewound back to a certain point in time, to what medieval masons, for example, should have done if they'd built the churches properly in the first place, and so on. And it was all about a particular approach called, what's rather grandly now called our philosophy, but the whole approach is to actually conserve as found. So it's all about conservation and repair rather than restoration, which is, strictly speaking, in an architectural sense, about turning a building back in time or changing it. So that's really a difference between the approach. And Morris set us up in 1877, and we now have about 8,500 members. We're an independent charity and the oldest group in the UK fighting to protect old buildings.
So you're fighting to protect these buildings. Are more of them coming about in this state, or is it more relevant today than it was back then, or how have things changed?
It's really to do with the nature of the threat. In the past, there was outright demolition of old buildings, whereas today, yes, occasionally it still happens, for example, with the Channel Tunnel rail link, or, heaven forbid, further expansion of airports such as Stansted, which would have a catastrophic effect on the historic built environment locally. Now it tends to be perhaps the way in which buildings are conserved, and often the damage is unintentional, and people using materials that don't work sympathetically with older buildings that not just look different but are intended to perform differently. So, for example, with a new building, you're often reliant on a system of cavities, barriers and membranes to exclude moisture and rain and so forth. It's rather like a raincoat. With an older building, it's more analogous to an overcoat, so it allows some moisture to come into the building, perhaps when it's raining, into the fabric, that is, to a certain extent, perhaps into a thick wall, but it will evaporate out when the conditions change. So we talk about an old building being breathable. It allows moisture to pass readily through the fabric, and as I say, it's an overcoat rather than a raincoat. So there's that difference of approach between the two types of construction. The older, what's generally called traditional construction, and the newer, the modern buildings.
Maybe you could explain the listing process, because I imagine a lot of the buildings that you're referring to might be listed, but we do have an international audience, and I'm not sure, is that something that would exist in lots of countries, this protection?
Protection exists in many countries. It varies hugely in the way it's actually implemented. For example, I was showing a group around from France yesterday who are very passionate about their heritage. In the UK, we have three bands. We have Grade 1, which is the top band, the smallest percentage of buildings. Grade 2 star, the star is very important, that's the next band. And then Grade 2, which is a vast majority of older buildings. And then, of course, we have things such as conservation areas, wider zones of protection, and things like scheduled monuments.
And what does that mean then when we think in terms of energy efficiency? What can we do? Are we restricted by being listed, or is that actually a very good thing?
The listing can actually be a very good thing, because people often unwittingly will dash to improve the energy efficiency of their house, and perhaps they could cause unintended harm to it. For example, by not considering the aspects to do with breathability, they could effectively be treating it like a new building. And whilst the measures would be absolutely fine for a 1960s or 70s house, anything predating about 1919, you need to consider that breathability that we just spoke about. So you'd use breathable materials such as lime mortar or lime plaster, or systems that have that breathable quality to them. If you don't, there's a risk that you could very well turn a cold damp building into a warm damp building and trigger off rot, decay, rusting, mould, and even aggravate human health ailments such as asthma and so on. So it's very important. Not only that, you could well damage the aesthetic qualities of the building as well, and also unwittingly take out a lot of components that in fact have a long lifespan left. For example, people often will take out a single glazed window, which is built with really good quality timber, and replace it perhaps with a plastic window and double glazing. And in a lot of cases, we see that the seals go. I've had a friend, for example, whose seals on their double glazing have gone after literally a couple of years. And the previous owner had taken out the windows, which were good quality Victorian ones. They would have had a perfectly decent lifespan left, far better than timber that you can generally get today. And it doesn't make sense from an energy efficiency point of view. If you're taking out these windows, you're not only saving little, if any, energy, but you're damaging the very qualities of the building that you're trying to protect in the first place. We spoke about trying to retain as much as possible of the physical fabric of the building, and obviously you're diminishing those qualities if you're removing authentic elements of the fabric.
As you were saying that, I started to think of some of the streets around where I live in Hertford, and clearly a lot of windows have been replaced, and they never look right.
No,
I will admit that. But these people must be making these changes for a reason.
They're making changes for a reason. They're often driven by the very laudable aim of improving energy efficiency. But we would say that it's important to actually, in terms of the way you approach buildings, we would say that, obviously going back to William Morris's visual principles, to retain as much as possible of the physical fabric of the building and the overall essence of it. And you do that by using compatible materials and methods, and carrying out only work that's essential for the long-term survival of the building, but also underpinning that work with good information and a good understanding of the building. So we would often suggest, for example, that rather than just go out and blitz a building with new windows, perhaps consider where you're losing energy. So, for example, carry out thermal imaging or an air pressurization test, and you can really pinpoint often where the drafts, etc., are occurring. And rather than just do a blanket approach and put in new windows, also consider, in fact, how much energy you would save, because the research by people such as Historic Scotland show that, in fact, you can meet or exceed the value of new double glazing by upgrading existing windows, using secondary glazing and so on. So whilst, yes, it's very good that people are thinking along the lines of being greener, if they just rush into it without having the full facts, they can actually, as I say, save little, if any, energy and damage the building in the long term, which is obviously in no one's best interests.
One of my core reasons for coming here today was to ask this question. Is conservation, restoration, are those techniques becoming more effective when we think about energy efficiency?
All the time we're refining our techniques. I think one of the problems has been that, yes, we're trying to base what we're doing on good information, but in fact it can be really difficult to know exactly what is in the best interest of an old building. So the SPAB has entered into a number of research projects in recent years, and we're beginning to get information through, and it bears out, in fact, what we thought was the case, but it's good to underpin our advice with robust scientific evidence. But, for example, we're finding that in 77% of cases, the U value, that's the thermal transmittance of a wall, is actually better than the calculated value when we measure it in situ. And we've measured a whole series of buildings, different methods and materials, so wattle and daub, stone buildings, cob buildings, a whole range of vernacular building, traditional building materials in different parts of the country, supported by English Heritage and the Dartmoor National Park Authority. And in 77% of cases, the U values are lower than what was calculated. And that's partly because of the way they're constructed. We often, when we're doing the calculations, we don't know quite what the construction of the wall is. And even if we do, there's often very little data that relates to those materials in terms of inputting data into the software. And obviously, if it's garbage in, you get garbage out. So, in fact, the U values aren't as disastrous as people often think.
I know that we're in the quite early stages, really, aren't we, of this sort of research. Is there anything that you would like to carry out if the funds mysteriously became available from somewhere? What would you really like to be finding out?
I mean, we are looking for funds all the time to further our research projects. For example, we are trying to establish what the limits are in terms of insulating and making older buildings more airtight. For example, we are beginning to think that, or the general conclusions that we're beginning to find are that if you try and insulate a traditionally built building below a U value of about 0.4, then that could have technical risk. So the risk that I spoke about in terms of mould and rotten and so forth. And equally, when you're reducing the number of air changes per hour, if we reduce it below about 0.4 or 5, we're beginning to think that in fact that could have negative consequences. But there's a lot more research that could be done, and also into the software, the programs such as WFI that are used and the hygrothermal modelling, there's a lot more that could be done into refining those, and a lot more data that could be used to really improve the whole basis upon which we're making decisions at the moment. And also in terms of looking into the performance and the detailed statistics relating to traditional building materials. So a lot more needs to be researched, and we've only really scratched the surface so far, albeit we've got some very interesting and helpful conclusions, but it's only the beginning.
I've certainly found myself using the word sustainable a fair amount in the last few episodes in particular. And when I look at historic buildings, are they actually more sustainable because you can see how they've lasted through the ages? Where do you stand on this?
So old buildings aren't necessarily the energy efficiency disaster that they're often portrayed or assumed to be. For example, they're very frequently built of materials with a lower embodied energy than their new counterparts. They frequently have a longer lifespan, and they're easier to repair than modern parts too. For example, if you take a window, a traditional timber window, a local carpenter could come along and just splice in a little repair there, and it will have then a longer lifespan. Whereas if you have often the modern counterparts, they can be proprietary systems that, if they do go wrong, perhaps the company is no longer trading in 50 or 60 years' time, they're not that easy to repair, and you end up replacing the whole lot. So that's not particularly sustainable. Older buildings not uncommonly possess features that are conducive to good energy efficiency. For example, they can have really thick thatched roofs, thick walls that are able to retain heat and release it gradually, and windows that are disposed to maximise daylight but minimise heat loss. And not only that, but many old buildings actually adapt well to modern living requirements and are constructed of a lime mortar, which makes recycling at the end of their lives much easier.
Where does this leave someone who is thinking of investing in a period property? Do we have to choose between we want to be faithful to the history, or actually we want to go down the route and be energy efficient? Maybe we should be looking somewhere else.
It's all about taking a balance. So it's not about freezing a building at a particular point in time and aspect or anything like that. From the SPAB stance, we would suggest a step-by-step approach. So first of all, undertake basic maintenance. For example, people often think about quite glamorous things like microgeneration, putting, say, a wind turbine up or something like that, and yet their gutter is leaking, and something simple like correcting a leaking gutter will prevent the wall becoming damp, and obviously a damp wall is an energy inefficient wall. So undertake the basic maintenance first of all, and every year we run a national maintenance week to emphasise that very point. The second step would be to consider the quick wins, so the low-hanging fruit effectively, the things that have a short payback and cause little disturbance to the historic fabric of the building. For example, things like draft-proofing windows, doors, topping up loft insulation, fitting thermostatic radiator valves, and that kind of thing. And then only as the next step, then consider the more major work, for example, upgrading your boiler and heating system, perhaps introducing a renewable heating source, or reinstating a missing lime renderer externally on your stonework, and so on. It's very helpful, we often find, to carry out some, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, thermal imaging or air tightness testing, just to help you pinpoint, particularly if you are considering anything more major. You can really target your measures then, rather than just taking a blanket approach and hoping that it will do some good. By spending a little bit of time and money at the outset, that can reap big rewards later on.
Quite a lot of my podcast series has been looking into the very efficient ways, the passive house approach, and I'm particularly sold on that for new build, but there have been examples of where houses have been converted to that standard. I know you put a lot of the house in the bin to get there. Yes, yeah. So I can understand that you'd be against that. But I have a question. If for people that might want to go down this route, or even to learn more, to experiment, what sort of properties will we be looking for that we're not going to affect the real history? What I'm saying is, can we almost use just, this place is falling down, here are the walls, let's keep those and build our building on the inside?
Generally speaking, I'd advocate that if you've got a building that predates about 1919, in other words, the traditional construction, then you would want a traditional approach and something that takes into account the breathability of the building. And in fact, the pre-1919 buildings constitute 1 in 5 of our building stock, so 20% of our building stock. So that's far more than just your listed buildings. It's actually a lot of the Victorian terraces, for example. So it's very important that you don't unintentionally compromise the breathability and lead to all the negative side effects that I mentioned earlier on. Anything post that period, generally speaking, not necessarily in every single case, but as a general rule, then you've got a much freer hand to consider some of the alternative approaches, such as passive house and approaches that hermetically seal a building. They're founded on and built on a completely different basis.
Is there a synergy at all in this between approaches that you can see going forward we might work out a better way, or it is just going in two different directions?
I think there is certainly a strand that says that, in fact, the more traditional approach could be applied to newer buildings, and people are, for example, using materials such as lime, perhaps in a modified way, mixing it with hemp, and there's certainly a strong strand. So it's not necessarily that the old approach isn't applicable to the newer approach in every case. So I think there are some very interesting developments, and it's a very fast-moving field at the moment. So all the time there are new developments coming to the fore, and for the past 4 years or so, the SPAB's ran an annual conference in the autumn. In fact, we've got one taking place up in York in a few weeks' time, where we present our own research findings. We also hear about what some of our other fellow organisations are up to in terms of their own research. But yes, it's a very fast-changing field, and one we're monitoring closely. And it would be interesting to see really where things go over the next few years.
Just as we get towards the end, on looking at the bigger picture, I know last year I was quite surprised to hear that a local historic building, Pontesbourne Park, was being taken down to build something new and energy efficient, and it was a big supermarket involved with this, so they seem to have got their way. But on the general theme of that, is there a risk that as people become more and more aware of what a new building can do in terms of much reduced costs and much higher levels of comfort, that they may neglect the old buildings or choose just to walk away from them, in which case there becomes almost a dangerous situation for these old buildings?
I think that's one of the reasons why we're not totally against upgrading older buildings, because if we said that people shouldn't undertake any effort to thermally improve an old building, then I think they would just be seen as a liability. Having said that, and I think it was borne out by the energy performance certificates, which I should add, since the beginning of 2013, aren't required now for listed buildings. That's often not appreciated, but since that date, there's no requirement for an EPC for a listed building. But a lot of those were, in fact, being, even before they were withdrawn, being taken with a pinch of salt because of some of the recommendations that were coming out of them. And people do like to live in old buildings. So I don't think there's a long-term threat per se, but I think, we do need to be careful and to make them comfortable and fit for 21st century living.
I live in a Victorian terrace at the moment, and according to all the data that I've been collecting on it, it's an A-rated building.
Right.
I don't know whether that's true or whether it's just because I don't use any energy or try not to. But
yeah. I mean, quite at the end of the day, it does come down, you can have the most wonderfully energy efficient building, but if the occupants aren't sympathetic with the overall aim of saving energy, then you're not going to actually save much. And in fact, there's the rather perverse consequences where it's often been shown that, in fact, people that live in some of the more energy efficient houses are using them perhaps in a more cavalier fashion, and the money that they're saving from energy efficiency, they're going off and flying around the world, and in terms of carbon footprint, there are all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So I think the bigger picture is actually much more complicated than the black and white situation that's so often just portrayed to people.
Do you have final thoughts on this topic that we've been covering today that's worth leaving in our minds?
I think at the end of the day, conserving old buildings, as I've mentioned, is about keeping as much as possible of the physical fabric of the old building. And that comes back to the principles that were set out by William Morris when he founded us in 1877. So it could be argued that, albeit unwittingly, perhaps William Morris, in encouraging people to save old fabric and not to consume more resources in putting up new buildings, was one of the first people to be talking about sustainability.
Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
You can find the show notes for this episode at houseplanninghelp.com/33. There are some pictures of the houses that they've been testing, and at the bottom of the show notes you can leave a comment if there's something that you've got on your mind. I also have a question for you. Does conservation offer the best solution when making old houses energy efficient? So we're just about there for this session. My call to action today is if you can help spread the word about this podcast. If you find the content we produce helpful and you use Twitter, then this is what I'd like you to do. Head to houseplanninghelp.com/share, SHARE. And what this will do is it will pre-populate a tweet telling your followers that you've listened to the show and helping us connect with new people who may be interested in our content. And you can do this from your mobile, from an iPad, desktop, it doesn't matter at all. houseplanninghelp.com/share, and I would be eternally grateful, so thank you for that. Next time, Wilf Mennel is my guest as we look at whether a lot of energy efficient housing is distancing us from our environments. Until then, take care.